Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And I wanted to respond to a great question on the comments of the show. For those of you who follow the solo show, you know that if on any of my shows you give me a really inspiring question or comment that I think needs a in-depth, like 15, 20 hour long discussion, then I think it's a good way to actually deal with it. And this actually gets me to clarify what I mean by a few things. So let's actually get into this question. This was left, it's a very smart comment by Parelius. I believe that's how you're going to say that, this Latin name. See, they have their own channel. There's a few interesting things up there. People should check it out. But I'm going to share my screen so you can see this question. This is on a recent episode called Public Safety or Self-Defense. Richard Hunsinger and X Riviera Maya, which was by two people in the more or less Canadian magazine Negation. I don't think Negation is 100% Canadian, but I think I speculated that the authors were Canadian. They're not. They're American. I don't know their tendency. Some of their verbiage led me to believe that they have some history with Trotskyism, but transitional could mean a lot of things. But I'm not responding to that. I just wanted the context for the initial question, because this is a response to one of the functions I think a socialist movement and party should have, and why I have been very careful about popular frontism in the United States. And I've even pointed out that both Popular Front and United Front socialist strategies are based on European parliamentary constitutional orders, not the weird congressional order that we have in the United States. So some of these things may even work in Canada or in Mexico, but they wouldn't work here. And I'm not saying that because I believe America is like culturally exceptional, but our Constitution being an early, maybe even proto-liberal constitution, if not one of the earliest liberal constitutions, means that it works differently than later forms. And a lot of the strategies developed for the European context that sometimes work in other societies that base their parliamentary system on European context don't work here. But we'll still get into it. So let's go. Parelius comments, how would an obstructionist approach be able to still improve the lives of working class people in the short term? My take on that, very first question, is that you would be selective in your obstructionism. You would not oppose reforms that would benefit working class people, but you wouldn't sign on to them either because you wouldn't be empowered and thus couldn't control their implementation. So if you, for example, sign on in a coalitionary government to something like minimum wage, and the minimum wage is not capped correctly or isn't responsive to the market or is just kept generally low, then you will take the hit for that policy, even though you're not implementing it. You just enabled it to happen by throwing your support their way. I would say that this would make certain reforms harder to do in a coalitionary government. And again, this wouldn't apply in the United States anyway. But it would also mean if they are sabotaged with poison pills, like say the Affordable Care Act was, you are not owning the implementation of a poison pill policy that you cannot control and control how it is implemented. So I do think you could improve the lives of working class people by blocking things that would hurt them and not blocking things that would be helpful. But the reason why you don't want to sign up to them is that if you can't control their implementation, they can actually be used to make you seem less efficacious and your policies seem even more utopian than they may or may not be. All right. Would the obstructionists be strategic or would it include everything? It would be strategic. It would absolutely be strategic. I think that's a great question. And what I'm saying is there are things you wouldn't obstruct, but you just wouldn't necessarily sign on to or try to take credit for, right? So, for example, if I was in a socialist party and we were in a government and we didn't have control of that government by ourselves, if the Liberal Party wanted to pass a minimum wage, I would not oppose it. That's all I would do, though. All right. And again, the reason why is I don't control the government to control its implementation. So I might get stuck with a badly managed policy that makes progressive reforms or socialistic reforms look worse than they would even normally be. But I am also not getting in the way of things that could be helpful. Now, if the government is utterly reactionary, there are times where Marx actually encouraged people to be full obstructionist, but that was a strategic decision, not a universal blanket stance. One thing that comes to mind are the types of antics put on by the congressional Republicans. This even makes me wonder about entryism in the Republican Party would allow socialists to dispense with the sort of cultural shibboleth demanded by the Democratic Party. This would be advantageous for building workers' movements where you can accept members of the working class as they are without any specific demands on them when it comes to culture or social beliefs. I do think you do eventually have to put some specific demands on culture or social beliefs. But I actually don't think they would be the same ones as liberals. For example, I tend to be protective of people on cultural grounds, but I do not think attempts to force cultural hegemony when it's not really there go well. It gets viewed as tyrannical even by workers who otherwise would probably take a at least neutral stance towards a lot of these things. Now, on the thing about running in the GOP, I think running in the GOP has the same problem as running in the Democrats. But if one was going to run a campaign to change electoral politics in America, one would actually almost have to be bipartisan about it. And it's hard to imagine that happening under the current scenarios. Because one would not want to be seen as propping up, ill-fated, highly executive-driven regimes. So what one might do, is when one is building up power bases, is that one would probably do things like remain independent, maybe selectively caucus with conservative lawmakers, although they probably won't have you if they figure out your actual politics. But in an obstructionist fashion, this would be very easy to do. And be clear on, cultural shibboleths that are positive versus negative. Like, don't attract trans people is a different demand than you must share your pronouns no matter what. All right. Now, I don't think the latter is that big of an ask, but I will say that I think the former is way more important. And in union stuff, that's more or less what we do. I'm in a pretty educated union, so people have no problem with pronouns and whatnot most of the time. But if someone does, we don't usually push the issue. Just, are you attacking fellow workers who are of a different belief than you? Yeah, yes, no. And if yes, we have a problem with you. If no, your personal beliefs are your own business. And I really do think that's important, because I also think that increases people's fear of dealing with cultural issues that they're uncomfortable with in both directions, and makes building bridges a lot more important, which makes building solidarity a lot easier. I don't think that magically fixes it. I don't think it makes those tensions go away. And I do think some of those things are things socialists would have to fight on. But I'm not sure. That one would necessarily need to tail the Republicans the way we tail the Democrats. In fact, I would say we don't need to tail either one, and that's part of the problem. And there will be times on certain issues, like if you had anti-war Republicans or whatever, that not obstructing them would actually also make sense. All right. You would be strategic on that based on the interest of large scales of workers. All right. How could one be obstructionist and maintain populist support? I don't know. The GOP does it okay, but the thing is, eventually you do have to run a country. And one of my fears about the obstructionism that I don't talk a lot about, but is that, are you doing stuff to skill people in how to be democratically small d, democratically managing society and doing what the workers want in a responsible manner and encouraging more and more workers in that process? Are you skilling people to do that? Or are you just learning to obstruct? Because those are different skill sets. My thing is, though, that skill set of skilling workers and helping them integrate into the systems of running their own lives is better done in unions and in workplaces and in civic society than it is in the legislature. Which is why a party that is just focused on legislative gains is not going to do enough for workers, period. And this is why I think, and this gets to some questions that Aurelius brings up later, that we need to actually have almost a polycentric view of socialist institutions, most of which would actually not be party institutions, even if the goal is to build a socialist or workers' party. The reason why that would be is you need large-scale outlets into civic society to actually build up counterpower beyond just political power to pull this off. And in Europe, this was done through the unions, but because of both constitutional and legislative limitations on formal unionization in the United States, this would be a lot harder to do. Furthermore, in Europe, there were real checks on union power as the unions became more officially incorporated into the state. See both sectional bargaining in Italy and the limits of a dual power when it was incorporated in Sweden and a lot of the Nordic countries. It actually often made the unions more of an extension of state power more than the unions a check on socialist politicians. All right. But I do think if you look at like Republicans obstructing things for their base, it is broadly speaking popular until they go too far, or because it is clearly corrupting when they do certain things. And I don't know how you walk that fine line. I think socialists would have to try. And I know that seems like a cop-out, but I'm just trying to be as honest with you as I can about this as a strategy. For example, you could continuously try to attempt to allow public sector workers to strike, to define any strike as legal, and to make strike breaking illegal by both those employed to do it and management employing them, to create a public strike funds, or allow a union to be organized any way they see fit. Oh, I skipped a step. Does this preclude attempting to at least build or create programs or changes to the system? No, it does not. And that would be the point of certain non-obstructions that you would do with liberal parties. Marx didn't say that you should obstruct every single thing the liberal parties do. It's just that you shouldn't join them in government, because if they fuck it up, you're going to be tarred with that feather. Whereas if you are remaining neutral on those, even if they will help you because they might benefit some liberal electoral thing, you would still benefit from the reform, but you're not stuck with the egg on your face if it's implemented wrong. Furthermore, I also think socialists would be organizing workers to try to pressure liberal politicians to do the kind of reforms you're doing while you build up the power as a party. And this is a harder thing to conceptualize, but if you think about this, the obstructionist period is to show that you have some power, even if you don't have enough power to run the government or run a sitting coalitionary government. You're not in charge, basically. But if you are able to obstruct things that hurt workers and at least get out of the way for things that help workers, even if you are not sitting in ownership of that, you might have the ability to start building up the civic institutions to pressure other institutions to change. Because that's what you really want to do, is you want to build up power from below and above simultaneously. All right. For example, you could continuously attempt to allow public sector workers to strike, to define any strike as legal, to make strike breaking illegal by those employed to do so, and management's employing them to attempt to create a strike fund or to allow unions to be organized in a way they see fit. Now, I think the attempt to create a public strike fund would be great. I think the union stuff is actually vital. But I actually think a lot of that needs to be done by putting pressure on coalitionary partners from outside of the governmental party. You might be helping the unions have the space to do this themselves, thus increasing their willingness to work with you and help you take power without you necessarily being tarred with a mismanaged government run by liberals who do not do this well because they throw up red tape everywhere or whatever they do, or they make poison pill compromises with the conservatives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A personal scheme of mine is to use social housing to collapse private housing market by simply building so much housing that it puts downward pressures on the private market. You would have to change the tax law for that to work. That is why YIMBYism doesn't entirely work. But social housing could be a better way to do that than the normal YIMBYist building tactics, because the YIMBYist building tactics actually have a floor of a tax write-off. If you have enough money and you're making enough profits in other areas to use real estate as an investment, then you generally have enough money to take the full value of the rent as a write-off if you're not getting it, because you can as a profit loss under the U.S. tax code. And I think you can do it in most tax codes because it's just a profit loss. So how do you offset that? You'd have to offset that by other legal means. But social housing wouldn't be subject to that, because social housing would not just flood the market, it would also flood the market with cheaper housing that would not be beneficial for people to own and hold on to as a way of keeping the rents high, even if they're not renting them out. I mean, that's why there's so many buildings today that have like 10, 20% occupancy, and they're still building more of them, and you're not seeing rents go down. Now, what that does do for I'll give the NBS this, is it does tend to stop rents from going up a lot, at least more than inflation. And cities like Salt Lake have actually seen that. Rents have quit climbing so fast, but they're not going down, even though these buildings are basically being glutting the market, because right now this won't last forever, but right now the businesses who own them still make more money taking the loss as a tax write-off on their profitability than on lowering the rents. It's, that's just an economic incentive thing. Hell, I could even wonder if you could replicate some of the same strategies that Robert Moses used to make independent public organizations that essentially cannot be controlled or destroyed by usual democratic means. I actually very much think we should do that. I think the party actually needs a backbone of institutions. If you get to a party, whatever you mean by that, eventually I'll cover Phil Nail's discussions about the party, that come from workers' confrontations with the state and capital, which usually, unfortunately, right now tends to be riots. But I think riots have their own problems, obviously, and they create a shit ton of backlash. That's one area of contestation, and the other area is building up institutions that can create dual power mechanisms that are not just building up for an ideological cadre. The thing is, it can't just be mutual aid in the sense of what most people make mutual aid is like charity. Because mutual aid actually is not just locals giving to some committee that distributes things out in mutual aid. It has to be based in building up power through shared responsibility over these public service and things. But I think there's a lot to think about here. One thing I think that socialists need to do, whether we like it or not, is be willing to seem more neutral in the public sphere and not be wedded to always helping the progressive branch of the Democratic Party. Our interests have to be based on programmatic goals, right? Not being a subsidiary of the most progressive party of capital. If we make concessions or even non-obstruct liberal policies, there has to be a programmatic reason for it. And for going programmatism after the New Left did, because it's hard to get everyone to co-align on a program, actually leads everything up to the gust of popular sentiment and whoever's going to be the most charismatic in getting you to think that they know what justice is. This is a problem. The reason why I say that we should participate in electoral strategies but be obstructionists is not that we would remain obstructionists forever. It is that the obstruction would be so that even if we allow things to go through that help workers, we are not soiled with their mismanagement by other parties and other areas of society. And if we need to build up dual power mechanisms to be able to assume functions during that transition, we will do so. But one of the ways to have the social clout to build up those dual power mechanisms is to win electoral battles on a local level, particularly in the legislature. I hope that clarifies the strategic points. Now, there are those who say you shouldn't run in the electoral system at all under current things. A lot of communizers feel that way. A lot of left communists feel that way. I think that it's forgoing a realm where you can prove that you have social power. But I do think there's a lot of dangers there, particularly if you're wedded to one party's and one or two caucuses within one party as a way for you to operate, which unfortunately is the case for anyone doing electoral work now, or they're basically seen as outside spoilers who channel dissidents, but who have no effect on larger politics, often not even have their politics recuperated by the mainstream parties. They're just not, they're not efficacious even in recuperation. All right. I hope that helps. Thanks for the great question. I really appreciate it. And like I said, if you guys give me a good question that clarifies a topic, I'd love to discuss it as a brief show like this one. Take care, protect your peace, like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/varnblog. There's a free podcast if you don't want to watch this on YouTube. It's available on all your podcast apps. It's just the interview shows, but it's there. If you can't subscribe on the Patreon, and I know economic times are hard, I'd love shares and comments and reviews of the podcast on things like Spotify. Thank you.